What's up gamers, DreamcastGuy here, and today is a very special day. It's a time to actually celebrate. It's a time for me to sit down and actually play just some good old-fashioned Resident Evil with my weird yellow controller, because today is actually the 20th anniversary of the Sega Dreamcast's American launch. Yes, that's right, it has already been 2 decades since this amazing console burst out of the scene and then eventually burst into flames. What I want to do is talk about the impact of this console, some personal stories, and to try and talk about why I think that this system is so famous despite the fact that it failed. Now let's start off by talking about the games themselves, because nowadays people sort of overlook the fact that this system was actually completely groundbreaking. Pretty much everything they had on this was just basically trying to do something very, very fresh. A lot of times people during this era were trying to make games, well, still pretty 2D. This piece of hardware, for as crazy as the graphics are, was actually released alongside the Nintendo 64 and the original PlayStation. While everybody else was working on trying to make the original polygons look as polished as possible, this system was already just leaps and bounds ahead, trying to do emulation and basically creating 3D renderings that were completely impossible anywhere else. Now additionally, I think that part of the reason that people like this is because developers were trying to take games that already were out, maybe on other systems, and put them here in a more polished fashion. Like if you were going to play something like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, you're definitely going to want to play that on the Dreamcast. But additionally, something I really liked was that Sega was very, very clearly very happy with their system. They would actually give you tons of stuff like demo discs. They knew that they had something very, very good, and they were trying to get anybody to actually check it out. I mean, one of my first memories ever when it comes to the Dreamcast was before it came out, there were these giant tech demos of Echo the Dolphin that would be up at every single Best Buy. Just getting a chance to walk up to this kiosk and see what looked like a dolphin swimming around in just such crisp HD graphics was mind-blowing, because not only was this graphically impressive, but the Dreamcast was looking to try and innovate in a technological aspect. A lot of times when people think about the Sega Dreamcast catalog, there's definitely some great games to think about. Games that are managed to be crazy like Gundam, or super, super fun like Power Stone. But additionally, these games actually had something secret inside them that nothing else had, which is actual HD capabilities. High definition in the modern sense. Every Dreamcast game was actually made to go up to 1080p using one of these very easy little boxes. This is called the RGB mod. Well, it's not even a mod. This is actually just a standard wire that would plug into the back of your Dreamcast and output in full HD. This was the first console that was able to do it, and because of it, it made it where a lot of times people who are trying to update in the HD era started to look back on it. Now, something I've always found very fascinating about the Dreamcast is that, yes, it did fail, but it immediately exploded. The second that this thing went down, everybody started picking it up. Now, part of this is because of all the different people who are actually trying to crack the code. On the front of every Dreamcast, there are these tiny words that most gamers completely overlook, which is it says, powered by Windows CE. Now this is actually some very key information because basically this was a console that ran on computer architecture, which meant that some very clever people managed to start to crack into it. Almost immediately, as soon as the Dreamcast came out, people were digging through it. For the first time ever, it was actually very accessible to rummage through the code and try and edit it, or maybe make some stuff that might not be fully normal. This allowed people to do all sorts of stuff like hack their game files, or add in extra music tracks to a song. Like something I really liked is back in the day, people would actually edit Marvel vs. Capcom 2 so it would have different songs that were big and popular at the time. But additionally, you would sometimes stumble upon stuff like this. Now this is actually a disc that's been burned that is labeled the Disc of Awesomeness. Now on this disc is a lot of different emulators. It actually makes it where whenever I play my Dreamcast, if I want, I can also play stuff from other consoles. This actually also has every piece of DLC that was ever released on the Dreamcast. Because yes, there was actually some DLC back in the day. Some additional Sonic tracks. The way you could get the ultimate weapons in Skies of Arcadia was actually unlocked via the internet. But in general, this is something that really started to break down the boundaries. The idea that the Dreamcast wanted to be more than just a console, it wanted to be your world. Now, something I know a lot of people did is they got the Dreamcast keyboard and the Dreamcast mouse, which basically allowed you full access to the internet in a very, very easy fashion, even if you didn't have a home computer. I know a lot of people actually got some of their first browsing experiences ever in their life by using SegaNet. Clearly, what was going on here was that Sega wanted this to be the thing that actually blew your mind every day in every way. In this way, they were actually very, very successful in my opinion because it actually managed to do that. The Dreamcast, despite the fact that it never managed to sell enough units to be fully profitable, it was certainly very heavily talked about. And it's certainly one of those things that the second you saw it, it made an impact. Like, the first time I ever saw the Sega Dreamcast actually in person, where I got to sit down and play it, was the day it came out. It was actually very, very cold here in Texas on the morning of 9/9/99. The launch day. But what my friends and I used to do is we would actually all wake up at 6 a.m. and be ready for school at 7 a.m. and we'd all meet at my friend Bradley's house to play games for an hour before we walked across the street to school. It was just a pretty cool thing to do to sort of get us in the mood. But that morning when we went over to Bradley's house, he had hooked up something that we had never seen actually in person and playable, which was the Dreamcast. And it was the opening level of Sonic Adventure. As soon as I heard this music and this speed and just this crazy level of polish, I was hooked. Immediately, the second I saw the Dreamcast, I knew that I had to have it. I knew that I needed to actually play these games and see what the future of gaming would be like. And what's funny is that a lot of people really have stories like this.
The Sega Dreamcast. What an awesome, awesome system. I remember the first time I actually played a Sega Dreamcast, and honestly, it was a mind-blowing thing to me. I had seen previews of it in magazines, but without actually playing the system, you don't really know how it's going to work, how everything's going to look in action. The screenshots looked cool, but without actually playing it, it was hard to sort of judge. And I remember I went to Georgia to visit my buddy who had moved away during middle school, and I went to go visit him. He had just gotten a new Sega Dreamcast, and I remember he had NFL 2K. And I remember playing NFL 2K with him, and I was like, this is absolutely next level. Like, the jump from the PlayStation 1 and N64 to the Dreamcast was just so large in what developers could do with their games. And the Dreamcast was just an awesome piece of hardware. It had a really great library of games. It had a lot of interesting features as well. Things like the VMU, the built-in cable modem connection so that you could, attach it to your phone line and then play games online. Like, there was just so many little innovations with the Sega Dreamcast, and I just absolutely love the system. I still have my original Sega Dreamcast from when I was younger. It's a fantastic system with a fantastic library of games, and I definitely miss it because it's the last time Sega released a new home console, and it will probably be the last home console that we ever see from Sega. So it's awesome to see the Sega Dreamcast turn 20 years old. Like, Jesus Lord, I'm getting old evidently, but yeah, I love the Dreamcast.
Looking back at the Sega Dreamcast, I would say it was a weird system, as in it was very different from everything else around it. And there were a few things that really set it apart outside of, I would even say, the visuals at the time, which it was insane when it came out and what everything looked like when you first see something like Sonic Adventure. But seeing things like a VMU as a second screen that you had on your controller, or what I think was the biggest thing at the time, which was including a modem in each Dreamcast stock, like straight from the factory. So you knew that every system had a way to connect to the internet, and that way developers could create for that. And it was pretty amazing at the time to have a game system leverage that and go online or play games online. So you could go online to forums or check your mail and everything. They even had a keyboard, and it started to kind of merge the idea of home console and computer or multimedia device. How we have now, where we have systems that can do everything, really, if you look back on it, the Dreamcast got that ball rolling. It got everything started, and it's really amazing to think about that with Sega in right at the end of the 90s had this idea to try to do something crazy. And unfortunately, it didn't obviously work out, but it still is something to look back on and remember how they kind of set the standard for what we would eventually see home consoles become, which is a box that can pretty much do everything.
When it comes to the Dreamcast in general, it seems like the idea behind it was definitely better together. To make a console that wasn't just focused on it being fun and not just focused on selling units, but additionally, it was a console that forced you to make friends. I mean, these were some of the earliest online games that actually had chat functionalities. You could put people on a friends list and talk to them later, or actually meet up with buddies in Phantasy Star Online. I mean, even the memory cards themselves, these are actually called the VMU, the Visual Memory Unit. They had these little screens on them that would actually have little teeny tiny games you could play for fun when you're like on the playground or something, but if you wanted, if your buddy was a lot further along or something, by connecting two together, you could swap data, or sometimes even play versus games on the memory cards themselves, because the Dreamcast, more than anything, was about community. It was about trying to draw people together, which is why, even all these years later, people are still talking about it. People are actually still playing them. Some of these actually have still working online servers. Fans of this game are just so addicted to the super superior experiences they managed to craft 2 decades ago that they have created their own infrastructure. It's still actually possible to play a lot of these games over the internet. They have actually created these private servers, and you can use a Game Shark so that it will actually route through and connect to other players, and they're still fully accessible to this day. But additionally, we need to talk about something a little bit more in depth, which is the homebrew scene. Because you see, Dreamcast games are still coming out. This console, while it may be dead, has a continually growing catalog. One of the key features of the Dreamcast that made it so incredibly popular for game developers was that programming for it was extra accessible. You could actually just sit down and start making games with pretty much no background knowledge. As long as you were passionate and had a really genius idea in mind, you could actually craft your own cool games. And so because of it, pretty soon, people were actually getting in bored. Everybody wanted to try and jump on and see what they could think of it, to see what they could make with it. Like, Modern Vintage Gamer is actually a really interesting guy who managed to do tons and tons of hacking in the Xbox scene, and he started by researching stuff on the Dreamcast so many years ago.
The Dreamcast for me represents so many awesome things. First and foremost, this was the time where arcade quality games were finally coming home, with ports like Soul Calibur 2, Crazy Taxi, House of the Dead 2, just to name a few. You knew that this system was more than capable of handling anything that was in the arcades at the same time in the home. And that was really a first for me, because I've never really experienced anything that was kind of considered arcade perfect before the Sega Dreamcast came out. And when this system came out, I was in absolute awe. My jaw had dropped with some of the ports that were coming out from the arcade, and just amazed how the Dreamcast was able to pull it off. Now, I found out later, of course, that the Dreamcast has a lot of comparisons and a lot of things that are associated with the Naomi hardware, its kind of counterpart arcade hardware, and that makes a lot of sense because Sega had the forethought and the vision to really deliver arcade quality hardware in a home console, and the Dreamcast delivered that. But the second thing, and really more importantly for me as someone with a background in homebrew development, was the Dreamcast was really the first game system that had an amazing homebrew development scene going on, an underground homebrew scene. And there were things like SNES emulation and ports of Doom and Quake, and I saw Neo Geo CD emulation going on. This was really the system for me that made me, wake up and think, wow, there's this really cool scene that's going on where people are just porting things to these consoles. And at the time, I really didn't know how to get involved in those scenes. But as I followed the Dreamcast underground scene, I got more and more information about how people were porting things to the Dreamcast and how homebrew development was occurring on the Dreamcast. And there were so many amazing homebrew development tools for the Dreamcast, like the Callisto SDK and things like that, that really made the system so desirable. Now, I will say that I didn't actually use the Dreamcast for any homebrew development, but it really influenced me to get involved with the original Xbox scene a few years later. But really, at the end of the day, the Dreamcast is the system that really did it for me, that really influenced me to get involved in that scene. There is such an amazing underground homebrew development scene. Even to this day, there are still things being released for this awesome little system. And it's so good to see that the Dreamcast homebrew underground scene is still alive and kicking in 2019. And I know for a fact that it's going to continue well beyond this time.
When he talks about the homebrew scene, what's really kind of vital is to know that this is more than just mods. This is more than just porting things like Doom and Diablo to the Dreamcast. It's actually entirely new experiences. In the decade since its failure, we've actually gotten, hundreds of new games that have been made for the Dreamcast. These are fully original experiences. They're not based on anything, they're not trying to copy anything, they're literally fully new games that have fantastic art and really moving stories and great combat systems and killer soundtracks that have all been made for a console that may be past its prime. The reason the Dreamcast is important is because it tried to do what nobody else was. It had the best games, it had 4 ports for more fun, and honestly, it had games that everybody just wanted to pick up and play. I'm sad it failed. To be honest, I've thought a lot about if I had a time machine because I would want to fix some mistakes. Sega's done a lot of stuff great. Honestly, I think the Sega Saturn is cool, I like the Sega Genesis, and the Dreamcast has been my greatest inspiration in life. But there's definitely been some things they did that were not correct. I definitely had some reoccurring dreams about, I really wish I had an ability to take like a Nintendo Switch or a PlayStation 4 or something that's just ultra easy to tinker with and take it back to Sega in 1999 and give it to them. That way they could try and fix the Dreamcast, learn from the successes of the future to fix the mistakes of the past. But I guess I'm still satisfied with what it is. Did it make some mistakes? Yes. Did it fail? Absolutely. Is it the best console ever made? You're goddamn right. Thanks so much for watching. This has just been a video I wanted to do because this day is really important to me. You guys rock. Thank you for watching this, and I don't know. Thank you, really. I want to give you the most dedicated keep dreaming sign off of my entire life. Dreamcast lives on. Dreamcast is us. So do me a big favor and keep dreaming. This day makes me really happy.